Okay, this is chapter 23 from the book, The Medical Reformation. And this chapter is about the most memorable lines in nutrition history, especially vegan history, of course, the real nutritional history. Okay, talking about carbohydrates, John Mcdougall, first of all healthy populations eat a starch based diet. There are no exceptions. And so the benefit of seeing that is you can just figure out quickly. Epidemiology is super useful. The reason why carnivores like Birkett and these other BS artists will say epidemiology doesn't matter is because they know it proves they're wrong. Okay, where else are you going to get a billion person sample set? Look at China before 1970 when they're eating a rice-based diet, white rice diet, only 1% of calories from fat. They're all skinny. There's no such thing as a fat person. Okay, and it goes on and on. You know, the corn being the big staple in Mexico, wheat being the staple in a lot of areas in the Middle East, the potato in Ireland and Peru, the sweet potato in Papua New Guinea, sweet potato for a while, major staple in Okinawa back when they were healthy, etc., etc. Okay, let's see. And the reason why starch is the best food and makes you skinny is because it's low caloric density, it stretches your stomach, it's a polymer of glucose wrapped in fiber, it takes time for the intestinal enzymes to peel off the fiber, so you get a slow absorption of glucose into your blood. From the gut into the blood, you remain satisfied with hunger a prolonged amount of time. Early satiety because it stretches the stomach, being low caloric density. Prolonged satiety because it's a slow release of glucose into the blood. And beans are probably, the biggest prolongation of satisfied hunger, the second meal effect that's been called. Okay, Dennis Birkett, he says, high fiber diets protect patients from abdominal pressure syndrome. Yeah, I gave an entire lecture about this. Probably my best lecture on that would be my Western abdomen diseases. I talked about, do you have abdominal pressure syndrome? Basically, fiber adds water to the stool, making it diluted, liquefied, especially on the right side of the colon, and that prevents all the back pressure when you defecate. So you're popping out cow patty like stools rather than Tootsie Rolls or goat pellets. And that avoids abdominal pressure from Valsalva syndrome, and that prevents a whole bunch of diseases. Okay, Durian Ryder, he says, sugar is the most powerful performance enhancer for your brain, your muscles, and your dong. Okay, and Durian Ryder, I like the fact that guy, he's out there running, races on foot. He's running, he's competing in bicycle races. He's training athletes. So he's real performance based in the real world. I have found that if I guzzle down like 32 ounces of beet juice and chase it with, maybe about 12 ounces of water, I get optimal energy. I've done that hundreds of times for giving long lectures and for lifting weights, heavy weights, like, high repetition squats and stuff. Okay, a quote from me. Fruit tastes great, but less filling than our starches. Okay, so that's a little bit silly there. But the point is, like the old Bud Light commercial, the point was that fruits, you don't feel like you need to stop eating them. If you eat a big bowl of starch, you're full, you're done. You don't want any more starch. But with fruits, I've had the experiences, man, I could eat 5 apples, 10 apples, 15, and I could keep going. So I'm careful with fruit. It doesn't satisfy hunger. There's a whole, I give a whole lecture on fructose, why that is the case. But that's one of the dangers of fruit. I know there's a lot of real skinny people that eat tons of fruit, raw fruit, and all that stuff, but a lot of them are relatively healthy, athletic people, whereas most people don't exercise that much. And as you get older, especially, you're stuck in jobs, you're stuck taking care of your family, and, fruits can potentially, you can overeat them. All right, lipid. Caldwell Esselstyn, he says, no oil, not one drop. Moderation kills. He's kind of like an Old Testament God, Caldwell Esselstyn, when he gets onto his, I think, you should only see Old Testament prophet, better choice of words. You should only see heart disease. You only see heart disease in the countries that eat a lot of meat and oils. Coronary artery disease is a foodborne illness. Coronary artery disease is a toothless tiger that need not ever exist. Yeah, he's got by far the best results of anybody in the history of the world for treatment of coronary artery disease. And if you compared his diet with the optimized version of the Mediterranean diet, the so-called Lyon study, he was like 30-something times better than that. And other studies I read, what do you want to do to reduce coronary disease? Reduce dietary fat intake is like the main thing. Okay, Nathan Pritikin, he says it clear, fat is bad. Nathan Pritikin was a genius. He's super logical. I really like reading his books. And he digs deep into the literature and, everything that was available up until his time, like let's say about till 1980. And he does a great job of summarizing it. He showed in studies where they fed people 0.75% fat, the people did very well. They did not even need 1% of calories from fat. They also showed studies where people were fed only 2.5% of their calories from protein, and they did very well too. So the point I'm saying is, on any naturally chosen diet, it's impossible to be too low in fat or too low in protein. So you should forget about that. Roy Swank. Central Norway ate a lot of saturated fat, and they had a lot of multiple sclerosis. Coastal Norway ate much less saturated fat, and they had much less multiple sclerosis. All right, what's interesting about that too, Roy Swank made the point, there's not a big difference in latitude between central Norway and coastal Norway, and it was the diet, especially the dairy intake, that was associated with much higher multiple sclerosis. The point is, some people will say, if you look at a regular globe, the farther you get from the equator, the more autoimmune diseases. Well, the farther you get from the equator, the more people eat meat and animal foods. Other people said, well, it was because of the vitamin D difference. And so the point I'm making is, it doesn't appear to be due to the vitamin D difference, because that doesn't change much in terms of sun exposure in coastal Norway versus central Norway. So that was useful in that sense. Okay, John Mcdougall. Okay, no, a couple more things from Roy Swank. I don't think there were any multiple sclerosis patients in China. Tons of population and no MS that he could find, because they're eating that rice-based diet. Rice is only white rice is only 1% of calories from fat. The dietary fat causes red blood cells to stick together as blood sludge. This decreases oxygen transport to the tissues, and it seems to damage the blood-brain barrier. Yeah, I had a lecture. You might want to see my lecture on multiple sclerosis to go into more detail on that, and on blood flow and atherosclerosis. Okay, real nice video by Swank. It's 50 seconds long about high-fat meal and blood sludge. It's available at the Dr. Mcdougall channel. Okay, Dr. Mcdougall says, the fat you eat is the fat you wear. The higher the percentage of calories from fat, the fatter the population is. So white rice, potatoes, and sweet potatoes all have 1% of calories from fat. So you eat that stuff, you'll stay pretty thin. If you look at the beans, lowest percentage of calories of beans would be like lentils at 3% fat. Black beans about 4% fat. You're getting more fat when you go to garbanzos. They're about 13% fat, but that's still a relatively low fat. Oatmeal is like what, about 15, 16% fat? That's still relatively low. Like comparison to animal foods like meat. Let's say salmon. Salmon's 50-50 food. 50% calories from fat, 50% from protein. So to me, that's incredibly high protein and fat. I would never eat that. Okay, I think the whole thing people out saying fish is good for you is complete nonsense. It's actually quite bad for you. Okay, Jeff Nelson at the Veg Source YouTube channel, he says the fat in nuts is also bad for blood flow. The benefits of omega-3 fats are exaggerated. He has a great video also where he shows photos of skinny vegans and fat paleo carnivores over 60 years old. So Jeff Nelson, he takes on a lot of difficult subjects, and you have to be willing to, face the critics, because whenever you criticize all this popular stuff, you get a lot of people, you get a lot of trolls and a lot of fusses made, but he tells the truth, okay? He's super smart and he tells the truth. Those are the best videos on those subjects, on nuts and on omega-3 fats. Okay, William Roberts, he says when you feed herbivores, humans, a high-fat diet, all herbivores get atherosclerosis. Humans are herbivores. So what he's basically saying is, if you take in a bunch of humans and you fed them a high-fat diet, you don't have to wonder which one has atherosclerosis. They all do. Eggs are what you feed an animal to cause atherosclerosis. I think that's funny. I also know to make an animal fat, you feed them a lot of MSG or MFG, manufactured free glutamate. They get addicted to the food and they overeat. But that's a good one. Eggs are what you feed an animal to cause atherosclerosis. Because a lot of people try to say that eggs are good food. Or they try to say, well, they're, grass-fed, free range. All right, coronary artery atherosclerosis is always multivessel. Yeah, he did a great study. It's like the best paper ever written on coronary artery disease, where he did like 2,000 autopsies on patients who died from coronary artery disease, and it was always diffuse. It was always about the same severity in all three of the coronary arteries, the left anterior descending, circumflex, and the right coronary artery. So he says there's no such thing as single vessel coronary artery disease. That is a myth. You can get that impression based on a cardiac cath, but he says it's not accurate compared to autopsy. Autopsy is much more accurate than cardiac cath. Same thing as coronary artery angiogram. Okay, Michael Brownlee, PhD. This is the guy who wrote the best paper ever written in the history of diabetes. It was called Unifying Theory of Diabetes Complications. It came out in about 2004. It's available at the American Diabetic Association site. You can also, if you sign in there, you have to give him your email if you want to see his lecture, the video, but just get the paper. If you want to understand diabetes, it's the best thing ever written. It's a masterpiece. It's an AO, academic orgasm. Okay, so here's what he says. Excessive dietary fat causes reversal of electron transport in mitochondria. This causes insulin resistance. Insulin resistance causes hyperglycemia. Some cells, like endothelial cells, take up glucose in proportion to blood levels of glucose. Chronic hyperglycemia injures these cells. And you also have the same thing in the retina cells, so you get diabetic retinopathy. You have the same thing in the kidneys, so you get diabetic nephropathy. You have the same thing in the peripheral nerves, like going to the legs, so you get diabetic peripheral neuropathy. Okay, so that was a masterpiece of a paper. And he shows how the reversal of electron transport leads to electron leak, like the level of complex 3. The electrons drop onto the oxygens in the mitochondrial matrix. They convert it into superoxide anions, which is a reactive oxygen species. So you get oxidative stress, and it damages DNA, like in the mitochondria, and it secondarily leads to a backup of Krebs cycle and a backup of glycolysis going out to the cytoplasm. And he goes through all the secondary problems that come from that, including the production of advanced glycation end products. It's just an awesome paper. One of the best papers on any subject I ever read in my life. Okay, next one is Gerald Shulman. He's an MD PhD guy. By the way, Michael Brownlee won the Banting Award, Best Diabetes Researcher in the World in 2004. Gerald Shulman won the award as Best Diabetes Researcher in the World in 2018. And his group out of Yale, they used nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. He said, with nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, we have confirmed that excessive fat in skeletal muscle is the first detectable finding of insulin resistance and the main cause of insulin resistance during the postprandial phase, so after eating. So there it is. It's been confirmed in a bunch of different ways. You know, J. Shirley Sweeney back in 1927 wrote the paper with the healthy medical student volunteers. You feed them a high-fat diet, they become diabetic, okay? You reverse it, you feed them a low-fat diet. And a bunch of people confirm that. The Himsworth study, the Rabinowitz study, and others. Okay, so what else did he say? Accumulation of fat in the liver is the main cause of hyperglycemia during the fasting phase. Okay, so that was in the skeletal muscle during the postprandial phase after eating, and in the liver, fasting hyperglycemia. Okay, and this is, he calls it the ectopic fat theory of diabetes. Okay, now Roy Taylor also worked with Gerald Shulman for a while over at Yale with nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy and studying diabetes patients. He also used MRI of the liver to study fatty liver. So he won the Banting Award in 2012, and what he showed was if you take a bunch of diabetics, type 2s, who had it for 4 years or less, relatively recent, so they still got more beta cell function, and you get them to lose 30 pounds of weight or more, almost every single one of them will resolve their fatty liver and be cured of their diabetes. Okay. He a lot of times, though, was using these shakes, you know, food shakes, smoothies and stuff, and it didn't seem to me that sustainable of a diet. But still, he proved all you got to do is lose the weight. And basically, if you eat a low-fat vegan diet, you'll tend to optimize your body weight. Okay, some quotes from me. There's no such thing as good fats except secret fat. Yeah, all the fats, like Nathan Pritikin said, they're all bad. Secret fat is just the idea of fiber. And fiber itself gets converted into fat. Some of it in the colon, it gets converted into short-chain fatty acids. And that's the good fat because it comes in at the end of the game of the digestive tract, and it avoids causation of leaky gut. It actually prevents leaky gut. So you get a double benefit. You avoid leaky gut, and you get protection from leaky gut. And you make the butyrate. Not only does it protect your intestine from leaky gut, meaning protect you from being prothrombotic, protect you from autoimmune disease, it also is used to maintain the tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier, so it improves cognitive function. And Dennis Birkett said he thinks we're designed to eat 100 grams or more of fiber every day. It's thought the minimum you should get is about 50 grams per day. Average American's only getting about 10 grams per day. It's pathetic. Should never want to compare yourself to the average American because the average American's really not healthy. They're really not well educated. They don't age well. You don't want to be like average. It's kind of like the joke Kiyosaki, the guy who wrote Rich Dad Poor Dad. People say, well, what's your advice for the average investor? And he said, don't be average. And it's a bit of a joke, but the point is you don't want to mimic the herd of ignoramuses. You want to mimic people that are doing well, learn from them. Well, gee, everybody in this country eats a plant-based diet. They're all skinny with no high blood pressure and diabetes. That's a good idea. Okay, T. Colin Campbell on protein. And his big famous book is The China Study, one of the best nutrition books ever written. And he said, animal protein is the most powerful tumor promoter. With rodents, we increased the amount of animal protein in their diets. When we did that, they grew more tumors. When we reduced the animal protein in their diets, they grew less tumors. To some extent, we could turn the cancer on and off. So that's an amazing statement. He could turn cancer on and off just by varying the amount of animal protein in their diets. Okay, if they got it below 5%, they tend to do fantastic. Ideally, there should be 0% animal protein. There was no least safe amount that didn't increase the risk somewhat. When you get animal protein over 20%, the incidence of cancer goes markedly up. And he kind of pointed out that animal protein to some extent has sort of an anabolic effect, partly because it's got different amino acid composition with more leucine, that's an essential amino acid, more methionine, another essential amino acid, and it just tends to activate mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin, or mechanistic target of rapamycin is what mTOR means, and that's the nutrient sensing pathway to stimulate growth. So the bottom line is when you eat animal foods, you're stimulating the growth pathway to get cells to replicate. Well, if you got cancer, the last thing in the world you want is those cells replicating. Sorry, I just rubbed my fingernail against the microphone by accident. Sorry about that. Walter Kempner, a low-protein diet lowers the workload of the kidneys. Yeah, about 75% of the work the kidneys do is excreting nitrogen. So if you reduce your dietary intake of nitrogen, of protein, you make life easier for your kidneys. There's no nitrogen in carbohydrate. There's no nitrogen in fat. It only comes in protein, and we don't have any good way to store it long term. We got like maybe brief buffers of, I don't know exactly how long they last, 30 minutes or something, but we don't have any long-term buffer for protein storage. So, all right, next thing, James R. Mitchell. The less protein an animal eats, the longer it lives. That's a big statement. The less protein an animal eats, the longer it lives. And that seems to be true for humans too. Caloric restriction has been shown to increase longevity. It appears that the same effect can be achieved by protein restriction, perhaps even just by restricting one amino acid like methionine. Okay, do you realize how beautiful that is, what he's saying? So to caloric restrict is almost like you got to starve yourself, and that doesn't sound like fun, so nobody wants to do that. So he makes the point where you can get the same effect as caloric restriction just by restricting protein. And that still sounds a lot better, a lot more doable. You can eat low-protein foods, certainly. You know, rice is about 7 or 8% calories from protein, white rice. If you look at potatoes, they're about 8% calories from protein. Sweet potatoes are about 4.5%. So I think sweet potatoes are the healthiest food in the whole world. Okay, but even still, he says if you can just restrict one amino acid, one essential amino acid, that appears to be able to get just about the same benefits of longevity. So that's pretty clever. Okay, whenever protein is restricted, there's a relative shortage of amino acids being available for gluconeogenesis. That means to make glucose out of amino acids in the liver. So what he says is happening instead is that adipose tissue gets broken down, and the triglycerides are broken down. A triglyceride is a backbone of glycerol with 3 fatty acids on it. So what's the point? The point is when you lower your dietary protein, you force your body to break down more fat, which is exactly what you want, okay? And the reason it breaks down the fat is it takes the glycerol molecules, you know, the backbone, kind of like a propane triol, and it takes that and it uses that, because remember, glucose is made out of 3 plus 3. It has 6 carbons, and the glycerol can just go right into the middle of glycolysis, or be used for gluconeogenesis, going backwards. So it can be very useful for making glucose. And the fatty acids, they're sent to the brown adipose tissue where they're burned for energy, or they're burned just for heat. It's almost like an unneeded waste product, and this will lead to weight loss. You're burning fat. That's exactly what people want. So here's what he's basically saying. Restrict protein and you'll burn fat, okay? Like I said, you know, the Chinese before 1970s and other populations that ate tons of white rice, there's nobody's fat. Okay, Leonard Hayflick, PhD guy. He's working with human tissue cultures, and he found that human somatic cells, which is most cells in the body other than your stem cells and your germ cells, they can only divide about 70 times before they die, and that is called the Hayflick limit after his name. And it occurs because the telomeres at the end of a chromosome, imagine they're sort of like this little tip of this pen, they're like the plastic cap on a shoelace. They shorten every time the neuron or any cell replicates because the DNA polymerase can't get to the far end of it. So eventually you keep shortening the chromosome until you get into essential genes that the cell needs to live. Okay, and the point is when you've got, let's say you've got early cancer. Lots of people have early cancer. I think just about everybody does. You want to slow down the replication of those cells, and that's how you do it. You don't do things that are going to accelerate the Hayflick limit, which would be like you want to avoid things that activate mTOR and cause the cell to replicate. Okay, that's a pretty cool concept. And they also showed lowering your stress level, getting your sleep, getting your exercise. That was the work of Ornish. Can help to maintain the length of your telomeres. Okay, that's what I just mentioned in the Dean Ornish research. You know, you can help maintain your telomeres. He did that research with a lady named Barbara something. I forgot her name off the top of my head. Okay, Peter Rogers. The more animal protein is more leucine and methionine than plant protein. Animal foods are also high in fat and iron. All of these things can activate mTOR and accelerate the rate of cell replication. So you speed up replication, you speed up arrival at the Hayflick limit, you speed up aging. That's the opposite of what you want to do. Okay, you want to age fast, smoke cigarettes, eat high-fat diets with a lot of animal foods, okay? You screw yourself. And that's what lots of Americans do. Maybe not all of them smoking as much as they used to, but still a lot of them smoke cigarettes. Stupid. Okay, miscellaneous statements. This is Chef AJ on weight loss. Chef AJ says, eat your veggies first. That way you just stretch your stomach with a very low caloric density food, and you'll end up eating less overall. If it's in your house, it's in your mouth. Yep, you got to get it out of the house, or sooner or later you're going to probably break down and eat it. The key to weight loss is to eat low caloric density foods like vegetables and starch. Eat your veggies first. Again, you get early satiety by stretching the stomach, and it limits the overall amount of calories you eat. And then she says, I can't eat nuts or I get fat. Yeah, like a lot of people, you can't eat high-fat foods, because I know there's a lot of famous nutrition experts who are telling people, oh, enjoy nuts and seeds and avocados and soy and omega-3 supplements and olive oil. I totally disagree with that, because I know my body, it wants to be fat. And if I gave it all that stuff, I don't think I'd be able to keep my weight together. And I've heard a lot of people tell me when they were eating the nuts and some of these other high-fat foods, they had more problems with their blood pressure and stuff, or their weight. I don't think it's a good idea. Nuts can be like 80 to 90% fat. There's a reason why Esselstyn doesn't allow his patients to eat any nuts. Okay, Richard Moore, MD, PhD. He's the guy who wrote The High Blood Pressure Solution, which is a magnificent book. And here's what he said. The reason black people have so much hypertension, it's not because of sodium sensitivity. It's because they don't eat enough potassium, because they don't eat enough plants. And they were not eating any more sodium than other populations, and so they had a lot of hypertension. P for plants, P for potassium. Okay, and that, of course, brings up the paper, the 1929 paper by Donison, that in Kenya, where they ate a plant-based diet in their hospitals, they had one group studied 1,800 consecutive hospital admissions, and what percent of patients were hypertensive? 0, because they were eating a plant-based diet. Populations who eat a plant-based diet have the same blood pressure in their teens and in their 70s. And by the way, that's also a masterpiece book, High Blood Pressure Solution. He spent his whole life doing research on ion pumps, with regard to the relationship to hypertension, and he explains it all real clear. John Mcdougall, and Chef AJ's got the best book, I would say, also on weight loss. Her best book, on weight loss. She's got the best book on weight loss. He's got the best book on high blood pressure, hypertension. Mcdougall's best book is Starch Solution. Okay. Mcdougall says most common cause of autoimmune disease is leaky gut. The body's always trying to heal. I had gone through a bunch of pathology books trying to understand autoimmune disease, and I couldn't understand it because they never mentioned leaky gut. So the first time I heard Mcdougall say that, I'm like, wow, that's great. And then everything started making sense. Okay, Jeff Nelson, he says, fiber is life, pharma is death. It's so concise and so true. Okay, here's a quote from Dean Ornish. Vegetarian diet and stress management enabled men with biopsy-proven low-grade prostate cancer to lower their PSA or at least keep it from increasing. Yeah, so he had something like about 98 patients, biopsy-proven, had declined any type of invasive therapy, no surgery, no radiation. And basically the ones that went on a vegan diet and helped manage their stress, they kept their PSA stable or down. PSA is prostate-specific antigen. It's a blood test used to indicate the risk of prostate cancer. So that's a miracle. I mean, it's basically what he showed was through diet and stress management, you can prevent the growth of prostate cancer in these low-grade prostate cancer patients, which is nice because a lot of the treatments for prostate cancer, they're really kind of brutal. The surgery often leaves men impotent, incontinent, with pain down in that area, exhausted, not good. Okay, Ruth Heidrich, PhD. She said the most common cause of disease is ignorance. Yeah, that's it by far. Most Americans are fat, sick, and stupid because they don't know what they're doing and they make themselves sick. So all they got to do is learn how to avoid the things that make you sick, and they'd be a lot healthier. And then she says, it only took me 2 hours to become a vegan after talking to Dr. Mcdougall. Right, because if you understand it, oil, processed foods, animal foods, they're basically, compared to plant foods, they're like poisons. So unless you're starving and there's nothing else available, why eat? Why not just eat the stuff that's good for you? Okay, because I see tons of people, they can never commit to a vegan diet, they half-ass everything, and they don't make much project. The people who are successful are the ones that go biblical. Thou shalt not eat animal foods. Thou shalt not eat oils. Thou shalt not eat high-fat foods. Okay, Sari Stanchik, MD. She had multiple sclerosis and was kind of going down the typical conventional medicine path of taking powerful, expensive drugs and not doing so well. And they seldom do that well with those drugs. And anyway, she, opened some books and read some papers and saw that identical twin studies show that MS was not genetic. She said something funny too. She also said, and she also started seeing nutrition studies suggesting that they were beneficial to these MS patients. She said that residency program for doctors trains them to be unhealthy. They're sleep deprived, they're stressed out, they drink lots of coffee, they eat a lot of processed food, and they stop exercising, which is funny. Yeah, so there's your preparation to be a clinical doctor and take care of patients. We're going to teach you all the bad habits. Okay, now this lady, Dr. Lorraine, she's a super smart lady. This lady's kind of an academic genius. And she said, you aren't sick because you have cancer. You have cancer because you're sick. And so indirectly, that's a lot like what Otto Warburg says. Otto Warburg, he's a guy who, the Warburg effect was the idea that cancers will tend to use 100 times more glucose than other cells. And what did he think was the reason for it? He felt that tissue hypoxia, 35% or more tissue hypoxia, can induce mitochondrial injury. And when the mitochondria become dysfunctional, cells will quite often die or just be dysfunctional, or they'll sometimes revert. They'll transform to a primitive earlier pathway, which they've kept in reserve of running glycolysis and anaerobically. And they then, have a whole bunch of other steps that come into play, but that's the transitional moment. And that is the foundation of what you would call the metabolic theory of cancer. And the reason I love the metabolic theory of cancer is everything else I've read supports it. I think the genetic theory of cancer, the mutation theory of cancer, that's called the somatic mutation theory, SMT. That one doesn't work. And the Genome Atlas project, in my opinion, pretty much showed that it doesn't work. It hardly ever works. There might be some exceptions, we're not going to get into all that, but the bread and butter, more common cause of cancer appears to be the metabolic theory of cancer. And Seyfried, did some good work on that as well. Okay, let's see, what else does she say? She says you need to learn God's way of healing, the vegan diet, Christian prayer, attitude of gratitude. In the Bible, God says if you follow his diet, Genesis 1:29, and his commandments, he will heal you. Yeah, it's another Bible quote. I don't have the reference there, but something like Deuteronomy or something, or Exodus. Okay, Jack Delatorre, PhD. He says chronic cerebral hypoperfusion, mouse equivalence, is the most common cause of dementia. Diabetes, hypertension, AFib, aortic stenosis, aortic regurgitation, congestive heart failure can all do this. By diabetes, I think we're sort of like talking about obstructive sleep apnea, or people over injecting themselves with insulin. So at night, when they put a continuous glucose monitor on it, they'll see they're sometimes dropping their blood sugars really low. So that's the mouse equivalent theory of dementia. It's a great theory. Okay. And then here's my theory of dementia. The Peter Rogers, MD, theory of dementia is that neurovascular uncoupling, a mismatch between oxygen delivery and metabolic rate, is the most common cause of dementia. And Delatorre is sort of a subset of that. And my theory is really a tremendously expanded version of the old calcium hypothesis. So basically, you got a metabolic rate in a neuron, and you got an oxygen and glucose delivery. So anything that increases the oxygen metabolic rate of the neuron, you need to increase oxygen and glucose delivery, to match them. Normally, they're coupled. Neuronal metabolic rate and vascular oxygen glucose delivery, NVU, neurovascular coupling, they're normally the same. But if you start taking these stimulants, things like caffeine, you're stressed out, sleep deprivation, aspartame, glyphosate, they all ramp up the metabolic rate. then caffeine's a vasoconstrictor, actually decreases blood supply, because normally it's such a small thing it doesn't matter, but when you add it to these other things it becomes significant. The caffeine, the stress, they also simultaneously will lower blood supply, like to the frontal lobes and the hippocampus. You don't need to be super smart when you're acutely stressed out. You need fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, that's what an animal does. So anyways, the more you lower the oxygen and glucose delivery, all these mitochondria inhibitors, I just gave a recent lecture on it and from this book. There's over 50 of them. Okay, the wider this gap is, you need ATP to pump calcium out of the cytoplasm. So all of that will make it worse. So anyway, stimulants are increasing the metabolic rate, and things that decrease blood flow to the lesion, like high-fat meals, like sodium vasoconstriction, like a lack of potassium, a lack of magnesium, those all make it work. A lack of nitrates in your diet because you don't eat enough plant foods. They'll widen this gap. And once this gap gets too wide between the metabolic rate of the neuron and the oxygen and glucose delivery, as well as the energy production, how well the mitochondria are working, this gap gets too wide, these neurons just die. They go into apoptosis, programmed cell death. And the thing that's great about that is it's so easy to understand. And EMF makes it worse, because EMF opens up voltage-gated calcium channels, pouring more calcium into the center of the cell, into the cytoplasm. And remember, all roads lead to Rome. All of these pathologies lead to increased cytoplasm calcium. Death by 1,000 cuts. So there's lots of things increasing cytoplasm calcium, and unless a person gets their act together, that calcium goes too high and the cell just dies. It goes into all these vicious cycles. You activate calpain. Calpain destroys the NACA exchanger. You can't pump the calcium out. Destroys the mitochondria. Cell dead. Okay. People always want, 1 plus 1 equals 2, but unfortunately in the real world, you seldom get 1 plus 1 equals 2. You get, 1.37 plus 2.56 plus 4.29 plus 5. That's just how it is, okay? But if you're willing to put a little bit of time into learn this, it's easy to prevent leaky gut. It's easy to, improve mitochondrial function. It's easy to protect your brain from these excitotoxins and from these vasoconstrictors. So why not do it? Okay, and then a lot of these other things you talk about, the endocrine chemicals like atrazine, they're also mitochondrial inhibitors. Okay, so they're a disaster. Okay, so the healthiest way to live, quote by me, Peter Rogers, is to live like Adam and Eve, but keep your indoor heating and plumbing. The average person tends to be happy to just say, well, at least I'm not as fat as my cousin. They have very low standards. They compare themselves to average. Okay, and my attitude is it's better to try to be as healthy as you can be. Like, I know a lot of people, and my wife will do this too. She'll say, that's not normal. Like, I'll say I want to do something a certain way. She goes, well, that's not normal. You're autistic. You're crazy. And I'm like, this will work better. What I'm saying will work better. To me, normal means nothing, okay? I'm not going to say, I don't know what my IQ is. There's a genetic IQ and there's a trained IQ. But, the difference between an average person's IQ is about 100. A mentally retarded person's an IQ of about 70. And so what I'm saying is, my IQ is far, far, far above 130. So compared to an average person is basically functioning at the level of mental retard compared to a smart person. So why would you want to imitate average people? Okay, I can tell you the average person I see, 60 years and up, they're fat, diabetic, hypertension, coronary artery disease, they're cognitively slow almost always. You don't want to be like them. You want to be fit, energetic, vital, with this glow of energy, coming out of you, your brain working quickly. That's where it comes from, all this health stuff. Also, I said you want to be healthy. Ischemic spine is the most common cause of back pain. I talk about F- and GP can make it worse by damaging collagen. And this is sort of my rough draft copy, so I got off the page somewhere here. But anyways, those are the best things ever said in nutrition, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other quotes that I haven't managed to get in here. If you have a good quote you think I should add for the next time I ever make another edition of this book, if I ever do, or if I ever give another lecture on it, please include them in the comments and I'll add them for next time. So hope that was helpful.